In the last module, we talked about how the U.S. policymaking process is highly complex, both in terms of the governmental structure, which is the system of federalism, as well as the system of checks and balances, or separation of powers, as well as the multitude of actors involved in this process. They can be the formal political actors, otherwise known as the various branches of government, or the informal actors, be it the public or interest groups. The takeaway from all of this is that the U.S. policymaking process is highly complex. But when you think about it, the Founding Fathers made this process complicated and complex for a reason. The goal was to make any change to the policy status quo difficult, thus preventing the tyranny of the majority, necessitating compromise, and yielding policy change driven by consensus. As we as political scientists and public policy analysts try to understand how and why policy decisions are made, or more generally, why change happens, or more often, why it doesn't happen. So we'll try and present and understand 5 theories of policymaking, as well as a 6th that are arguably one of the most widely used. These models pertain to the world of government, politics, and public policy, and they provide the concepts and language that facilitate communication with others about these subjects. The first theory to think about is elite theory. This is the idea that powerful individuals, those with money or influence, work to shape the development of policy in the American policy system. Who are these elites? We break them down into 3 types. The first are the executives, or the economic elites. You can think of these individuals as people like Warren Buffett or the Bill Gates of the world. Next are the cultural elites. These can be actors, movie stars, even social media influencers. Think Taylor Swift or Lady Gaga here. Finally, you have your political elites. These are your elected officials. Together, these 3 groups are the dominant movers and shakers in the policymaking process. Elite theory tends to work best for helping us to understand hard issues. These are complicated issues that are very under the surface for the American public. Often we call them non-salient, things that the American public really doesn't think about, or we don't really have preferences on. Elite theory does have 2 flaws, though. First, when you think about elites, they tend to be smaller and less representative groups than the American public. These elites compete with one another over areas of the policymaking process, and thus it's tough to dominate. Second, this theory tends to ignore public opinion. Thus, for easy issues, things that the American public has preferences on and we're concerned with, elite theory thus has a hard time explaining policy change. The next theory is group theory. It's the idea that changes to the status quo for policy are both dominated and shaped by interest groups. This process is characterized by a continuous struggle amongst organized interest. Power in the system is widely shared among interest groups, and each has access to the policymaking process. They fight amongst each other for influence, ultimately tugging and pulling the policy status quo in small directions one way or the other in the direction of the interests of that group. This idea is the Madisonian concept of pluralism. The modern variant of group theory today is what's known as advocacy coalitions. These are groups of policy actors from differing public and private institutions and levels of government, each with their own sets of preferences or differing sets of beliefs on how the public government should engage in policymaking. These alliances of ideas thus compete with one another to pull the status quo in one direction or the other. The problem with this framework is that certain groups, in particular business and economic interest groups, tend to dominate the process, thus exaggerating the role and power of interest groups. The next theory is institutional theory. This focuses on the formal and legal aspects of the government structure to understand who's allowed to be at the policymaking table. Basically, how it's arranged, the legal powers that are available, and the rules for decision making. This theory is all about rules, hence the term institutional. We know that institutions govern and shape the behavior of the actors within it. Thus, who has power, or thus the ability to direct and shape policies? This theory is concerned with the idea of power, or getting what you want when faced with opposition. The key concept to remember when it concerns power is that power is relative. You're only as strong as the opposition, or the other actors that are allowed in the policymaking process. The key problem with institutional theory is that it fails to account for actors outside of the formal political system. Think back to last module. Who were these actors? Informal actors, like interest groups and the American public. The next theory is rational choice theory. It's the idea that all actors or individuals are rational. What does rational mean? Well, this comes from the economics literature. It's the idea of costs versus benefits. If the benefits outweigh the costs of doing something, the idea is rational. However, if the costs outweigh the benefits and you still pursue that action, that's considered irrational. Thus, rational actors want to maximize the attainment of their preferences, or ultimately, further their self-interest. Rational choice theory helps us understand that policy decisions are made in the pursuit of self-interested behavior. To understand the behavior of politicians, we fall back on the seminal work of the author David Mayhew, and he wrote a book called Congress: The Electoral Connection. He concludes that elected officials are single-minded seekers of re-election. What does that mean? First and foremost, the goal of every elected official is to get re-elected. Because if you're not re-elected, what can't you do? You can't pursue policy, you can't pursue a legacy, you can't do anything else. Thus, everything politicians do as it relates to the rational choice theory is related to the self-interested behavior of getting re-elected. Yet the American public too is rational. It wants to maximize its benefit relative to its cost. Take an example, something like a gas hike. If they want to add an additional 10 cents on a gallon of gas, how will that impact you? You might get some sort of benefit, like maybe they'll put the money towards roads or the environment. However, you can think about this in terms of tangible cost. How many gallons does your car use? How much do you commute to school or to work in a given week? Thus, if the costs outweigh the benefits here, are you going to be supportive of a gas tax hike? Together, rational choice theory is pretty useful at predicting what policies will actually come to fruition because of, well, rational individuals are trying to protect their self-interests. Who will benefit from it? The problem, however, with this theory is that not all people are single-minded pursuers of their self-interest all the time. Sometimes politicians are strategic. They make political calculations of policy which can hurt them, but maybe in the long interest they benefit. Individuals can often operate under using altruistic behavior, doing things that benefit other individuals, but don't provide a tangible benefit back to the individual performing that act. The final theory is political systems theory. This is a more comprehensive but general theory to understanding how and why policy changes take place. It focuses on the way that the political system, that is, the interaction between the institutions and the various activities of government, responds to demands from the environment. In this case, think about public opinion or the pressure that interest groups put on the system itself. Political systems theory considers those inputs or those demands and considers the real-time changes, the policy outcomes that emerge from that system. And then finally, it looks to see how pressure changes. So think about this in terms of feedback. So thus, it's almost cyclical. You look for some sort of input to the system, look to see how the system responds, the outcomes from it, and then we give feedback from that to determine the next course of action. This is almost biological. You figure it this way, your body is like a system, a series of interconnected parts and systems within it. There could be some sort of input to the system. Think about something like a virus or a bacteria. We look to see what the outcome is from that, in this case, sickness, a variety of symptoms, runny nose, sick stomach, things like that. And then we give feedback. We look to see how the body responds. Do you get over the cold? How long does it last? The problem, however, with this approach is that political systems theory is overly complex. You need a lot of information to explain what's going on, and further, it takes a lot of resources to watch something start from policy input all the way to the output and ultimately give feedback.